Hey, good afternoon. My name is Rachel Wellman, and I will be facilitating our Clean Teleconference today, which is Tuesday, January 21st, 2025. And with me, we do have a guest speaker today, Dr. David Crookall, who will introduce in just a moment. I do want to ask, though, for any announcements, and if you could introduce yourself just in the chat. But if you do have any announcements to share, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Rummel. I'm an education designer at the UCAR Center for Science Education in Boulder, Colorado. And I have just a quick announcement. Later on this week, we're having a virtual workshop geared at elementary teachers, more lower elementary teachers, K through fourth grade, kind of 5 to 10-year-olds, just promoting the educational resources on our kids' website and giving tips about how to teach about weather and climate change using the resources on our kids' website. So I'll put a link in the chat to register. It's a free 1 hour, webinar type deal. So anyone can still register. I think some of my colleagues shared about it before as well. So probably something you heard before. That's all.
Excellent. Thank you, Melissa. Anyone else? And thank you so much for putting your introductions in the chat, and we can get through those later if we have time. We can have more discussion. But like I said, I want to give more time for Dr. Crookall for his presentation. So without further ado, Dr. David Crookall, he's been using simulations and games for all of his professional life and is now retired. And he has held positions in several universities in the United States, France, Singapore, and Thailand. He's published widely. He's an honorary member of the International Simulation and Gaming Association. He is currently lead guest editor of a special issue of the EGU, or European Geoscience Union journal, Geoscience Communication, on the theme of climate and ocean education and communication. And his presentation today is entitled An Essential but Overlooked Component of Geosimulations and Other Experiential Geo-Learning Activities. And Dr. Crookall, I'll turn it over to you if you want to share your screen.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. You call me David, honey. Now let me see if I can get this going. Something's happening. Can you all see this? No, I cannot see.
Not yet. So you just, did you hit share?
Can you cannot see my...
No, so sorry. We were practicing this earlier. Let's see. So share button.
Entire screen. 1. It worked before, didn't it?
It did.
Once you've selected the screen, you may have to hit share again. It's often at the bottom.
Oh, really?
Oh, good point, Ingrid. Thank you.
I wonder too, we changed the view. I think after David shared a screen the first time when we were practicing, so I might have changed things.
I was just thinking, did I mess that up?
Well, I can see my slides, but if you can't, there's a problem. Dear. Share.
Here we go.
You were right. Have to hit share again.
It's loading, or you now are just we see your internet browser, just not your slides yet.
Can you see
Perfect.
something?
Perfect. That's good.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks, Rachel, for a very nice introduction. I'm not going to repeat the title because Rachel very nicely said it. And some of my slides are going to be a little bit wonky, but the message is the important thing. So I want to ask a question. Perhaps I can ask you to reply with raising a hand. Who uses already experiential activities like hands-on, activity-based projects, problem? Maybe the people who have their, what's it called, cameras closed, it'd be really nice to kind of see you live. If that's possible, I don't know. Okay, and who uses games or role play? Can you raise your hands? Okay, very nice. And who has used or uses debriefing? Okay, so it looks like I need to talk with you about that. Now, I'm going to be talking about experiential activities and games. Our games are experiential activities, but there are differences. But debriefing needs to be applied to both of these. And anytime you have a question, raise your hand and we'll ask it straight away, and I'll see if I can provide some kind of answer, and then we'll move on. So it makes it a little bit more interactive. So what is debriefing? This is a description, not a definition. It's an episode during an activity or a game in which participants, they think about and they share their experience. And the purpose is to transform it into learning. And I think the key thing here is transforming into learning. But that happens through the reflection and the sharing. And I'll talk more about that as we go on. Now, this shows you a game with a debrief happening. It's a workshop I ran for teachers in Thailand several years ago. And it was a workshop about team building, but also about the use of games and simulations. Now, in the top photos, you can see the people participating in the game. They're building a tower in picture one. Now, I want to try and see if I can see the top of this. High floating, okay. Picture two, in the games that I run, I like to have somebody who is an observer. And they observe what's been going on, they make notes, they get a guide for making notes. Picture two is just part of at the end of the game where each of the teams, there are several teams taking part here, each of the teams presents their final tower, which is then evaluated. After all that, they then move on to the debrief, which is pictures 4 and 5. And I always like to have debrief in at least 2 different modes. They start off by filling in forms, individual forms, with specific questions that relate to the learning objectives. And then they come together in picture 5 and share their thoughts that they put down on their forms and any others that come up. And you can see another group doing the same at the back. And some teachers will say, oh, I don't want to lose control of these students or teachers or whoever it is. But the thing is that they get much more involved sometimes in the debriefing than in the game because they really feel they're learning. And I've had students at the end of a simulation who, when they finish, they say, okay, let's go and debrief now, because they know that they're going to be learning. Okay, so basic idea is that experience, be a game, plus debriefing leads to learning. And if you don't have the debriefing, you get much less learning, or I exaggerate and say no learning. So what is learning? And it's not usually very straightforward. It's something that a lot of people find difficult because you're discovering things that are new, and the human mind doesn't like change and things that are new. They like to stay in their own comfort zone. So it needs time, effort, motion, getting out of one's comfort zone, and so on. And the many kinds have active, cognitive, kinesthetic, and so on. And what I say is that there's no learning. If you have no learning, then there's no geoscience. All of the people who are in geoscience, whether it's teachers teaching climate or the top level geoscientists, they've all learnt it. They've gone through a learning process. And we tend to forget that. And teachers often also tend to forget the difficulties of the learning process. So I like to focus on the learning, and I say that geoscience will take care of itself. In geoscience and in climate change learning, they have opportunities everywhere to learn. You have hands-on stuff, participatory, field trips, research expeditions, and so on. And they all, in my view, require debriefing in order to learn well. And the learning happens through processing the experience. So we all have assumptions about what we do to learn, or what students do to learn. And for experience, we say that in an experience, learning just happens. We just send them on a field trip or something like that, and they're going to learn. That's not necessarily the case. The correct assumption is that the experience must be learned, must be processed, transformed to result in learning. And that is done in the debriefing. In games, we have assumptions about people learning in games, and I'm afraid that I'm rather critical. I've been in it for many years, and I find that some people doing games, they have completely the wrong assumptions about how people learn in them. And one of them is that learning is automatic. You just put people in a game and they automatically learn. They don't. And another very common assumption is that if they have fun, they automatically learn. That too is not true. And it depends on the kind of fun. Sometimes people seem to be having fun, and you have this kind of nervous laughter from participants, and they say, oh, they're having fun. But sometimes it's because they're nervous, because they're anxious, because they're having to participate in something for which they're not necessarily ready. So a game, to produce learning, it must be processed. So transforming experience leads to learning, and it's a cyclical process. And this quote from David, who's heard of David Kolb here? Yeah, can you raise your hands? Okay, if you get the chance to read some of his work or read websites about his work, he's done some absolutely marvelous work on learning from experience. And that applies to learning across the board. And he says that learning is the process whereby knowledge is created by the transformation of experience. And that's the bedrock, if you want, of his, well, it's not just theory, it's also practice. Now, very quickly, concrete experience field trip research is not the same as semi-simulated like an internship, and it's not the same as a game. So the debriefing that you do has to be adapted to whatever type of activity it is, and especially to the learning goals. Are there any questions so far, or any comments, or no? Yes?
Yes, I
Okay.
have a question.
Yes.
I actually still don't understand why having fun doesn't mean What did you say about having fun? Does it mean you don't really learn much if you feel
No,
like it's
no.
fun?
It doesn't automatically result in
Oh,
learning.
but oh, I see. So it
I mean,
means that if
you
I
can have fun, but people say, okay, in order to learn, we must have fun. But you look at people doing these kinds of experiential activities like internship or research or field trip or game, and they're not necessarily having fun. They're very concentrated, they're very serious about it. And sometimes they get frustrated. In some of the best games, people become emotionally involved and they get frustrated. And that has to be dealt with in the debriefing. So fun is it's a myth to say that in order to learn, we must have fun. And there's so many things we do in life from which we learn and we're not having fun. I mean, it's fun to learn.
Well, fun could be a byproduct, right?
I see. I understand now.
Yes,
Maybe.
could be, yes.
David, we have a question from Jim as well.
Right.
Yes, so David, this is great. What I want to pose as a question, perhaps when we do this, is how can programs that you're speaking of that I think are primarily in Europe better integrate with those that are in the United States, specifically where young people are actually taking part in the things you're talking about? How our programs that are in the United States can be more connected with yours. We need that more than ever now, because the United States is going to see tremendous changes, a lot of things. We're going to be under attack, those of us who do
Oh,
this.
yeah, I know.
We need to work with those in Europe who get what we're doing. I would like to say in shorthand, perhaps this is overly stated, but what you're speaking of so far, everything you said, this is what we've been doing for 25 years. So our students would love to connect with yours. It's so important to connect with students who are doing similar things no matter where they are in the world. So that's a kind of a question or a challenge as we're doing here. I hope we leave with how can our programs connect. Thank you.
Well, I mean, it's a very nice question. I'm not sure that I have an extremely strong answer. If you're trying to connect program leaders and teachers and educators across the Atlantic, then of course the international associations. And there's one that is truly international, is the International Simulation and Gaming Association, which holds a conference every year in a different country every year. And we've had it twice in the United States. And next year, in July, it's going to be in Stuttgart in Germany. And it really is worth attending. It's a conference in which people are very warm. They come and test out their ideas. They discuss other possibilities. They make connections and so on. We actually, in the EGU, and I think also in the AGU, have a games night, a game session where people come and present, talk about games, and then the games evening where people come and play games. But they're not very hot on debriefing, unfortunately. And I've done presentations, one or two, on debriefing, but I don't know what effect that has. For students, there are of course exchange programs, and I would say that universities in Europe, especially France, are not necessarily big users of games and debriefing, unfortunately. Some use them a lot. And we also, in France, we have several organizations that deal with it. There's one in French called Jeux et Enjeux, Games and Stakes, where we spend a week talking about games and ecological matters. And they use them a lot in ministries and so on, but it doesn't filter down so much to sort of grassroots teaching. So I'm not quite sure how to reply to that. I would suggest that you try and make contact, or you make contact with ISAGA. You can write to me afterwards, I'll send you the address. And then there are other organizations. There's an organization in the States which does a lot of games, which is called NASAGA, North American Simulation and Gaming Association. And there are a couple of others, national ones. But there are also educational associations. And then there's a conference happening in Poland in April, I think, on experiential learning. It's the International Experiential Learning Association, I believe. And David Kolb will be there, or he'll give a keynote. And that's probably worth attending. You can attend online. So I'll send the information to Rachel after, and then she can pass it on. So going to that conference in Poland is probably also, and I have never been before, but it's probably pretty good. And it's experiential learning in general, not just games. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but
Thank you. That's a good start.
okay, good.
And thank you,
Okay.
David. I actually did find the website for ISAGA and put it
yeah?
in the chat box for folks to
Okay.
see. Yep.
Mhm.
I guess I did have a quick question. I don't know if this is the appropriate time, but I guess my question through this is defining debriefing.
The what?
So defining debriefing. So I mean, so in some instances, it could be a conversation or it could be in writing. So I'm curious about where debriefing is defined, I guess, in terms of, do you see variances in methods
Okay.
or modes of debriefing?
Okay. Well, I think I come to some of those things a little bit later. So let me try and go through these next few slides very fast, but it gives you a bit of background or theory if you want. Dave Kolb's experiential learning cycle has 4 parts. You have your experience, then you reflect on it, then you conceptualize, then you experiment with what you've learned, and then try it out in a new concrete experience. That's the cycle in a nutshell. And in terms of debriefing, this is the same cycle. I say that the debriefing is actually these 3 things, but different aspects of it. And I'll come to some concrete examples of debriefing. And during the sequence of activities that you can use include filling in forms, discussions, creating an exhibition, doing an essay, a collage, and so on. It's very varied. Now, experience and simulation are slightly different. So I've sort of modified this a bit. And again, we have the debriefing. But simulation and concrete and ordinary experience are slightly different. You have experience in reality, whatever reality is. And simulation is simulation of reality. So it's not really the reality, it's its own reality. And that is why it's important to debrief the simulation, because you're going to look at the cognitive distance between the simulation you've just participated in and what the reality is. So now debriefing has to be planned and prepared. I use forms a lot. It has to be given the necessary time. Sometimes it's longer than the game itself. I did one simulation that lasted, this was in the United States. I ran a simulation about learning difficulty, and the simulation lasted 1 class period, 45 minutes. But then I did 3 and a bit periods for the debriefing. I hadn't planned it, but the students said, oh yes, we want to continue with this debriefing. So instead of spending another 1 class period, we did 3 and a bit. And they really had a lot to talk about. And it must be focused on the learning goals, not on the game objectives. It must be structured in various ways. And I like to do mine very participant-centered. And it must be non-threatening and done in a climate of trust. These are plans that have been developed by medical people. So the structure inside, you have to go through a sequence of topics. I'll come to that in a minute. You have several steps from part of several different activities to do for the debrief. Group memberships may change, and you have a sequence, or you may have a sequence of simulations. So as I said here, you have the simulation in pictures 1 and 2, and then the debriefing, and that's structured. And then the parts 4 and 5 of the debriefing is also structured into 2 parts there. What am I doing here? Now, the kind of topics that you look at, for example, when they're filling in this form here in picture 4, they could be answering questions about these kinds of topics. Feelings and emotions. What happened? Why did it happen? What are the similarities with the real world or differences? Of course, that would be, if you're doing a field trip that's not a simulation, then you probably won't have this question. What changes would you make to the game? What would you do differently next time? What do you think you learned? What commitments are you making to yourself for the future? Now, these are just the main topics that could be covered, and you may have other topics you want to cover. But you don't necessarily, each debriefing is going to be, tailored for your objectives, your pedagogical objectives. Now, this is the form. I've made, I don't know, I wouldn't say maybe hundreds, but tens and tens or dozens and dozens of forms. And each one is tailor-made for the simulation, the students, and so on. And this is one. Has anybody heard of Fishbank's simulation? No. Anybody heard of Dennis Meadows? Club of Rome. Limits to Growth. It's the book that started off this whole thing about sustainability. Now, Dennis is a friend, and he does simulations, because it's one way in which you can bring home a strong message. And this is a form that I developed for when I wanted to run the simulation. And the idea was feelings, then what actually happened. The detailed suggestions for each question are much more than what I often put in a form. So I try and keep the form as simple as possible. But this is for a group of university professors. And the space for writing is much bigger. This is just sort of crunched up a bit. Then why? What reasons do they have for what happened? Then they look at trust. Now, trust is not something I put in most debriefing forms, but the game of Fishbanks raises issues of trust, what people are deciding to do during their, if you want, time out and when they talk with each other in small groups. And then each group has, in the game, has different objectives. What were their objectives? Did they get them? Why? Why not? And then what are the analogies with the real world? What changes would you make? And what would you do differently if you participated again? And then what are their solutions? What solutions do they now think are appropriate for overfishing and depletion of resources? These are other structures, a little bit simpler. They're ones that have been developed by the medical people in medicine, and they're the people now who are doing probably the most in debriefing. They've done a lot of research and developed a lot of tools and so on. Now, the one thing I'm not so keen on with a lot of the medical debriefing is that it tends to be teacher-centered. But I like to have it completely participant-centered. So the participants debrief in their small group without interference from the teacher. And generally, I just walk around the class. I don't go too near the group. Occasionally, once they've done it once, in the next time I do debriefing them, I can walk out of the class for 10 minutes and give them the feeling that it's their responsibility, it's their thing. Now, this is what I tend to do as a general pattern. They do the individual form, as you saw in the picture. And then they do small group discussion with the new group form. That's what you saw in the second picture of the debriefing. Then after that, each group reports back to the other groups in a plenary. Then outside class, they prepare a PowerPoint in their group. And then the class after that, they present. So they're recycling all this. And so they're recycling, they're debriefing, they're going through it all each time and beginning to really understand some of the things. And very often when they're preparing their PowerPoint, I tell them, you've got to go and look at the documents, the literature about the topic that you have just done the game for. They've got to go and find out and relate their participation in the game to what has been written, to the science, as it were. Then they do the presentation at the end of the semester. They do a portfolio where they put everything together. So everything is recycled. And I've never, ever had a complaint from a student saying, well, we just keep on going over it because it's all done differently, see new things each time. I won't go into this now. This is too complicated. Now, any more questions? I can stop here. No?
David,
Okay.
maybe along with it is could you briefly say some categories in which you work with the young people who are participants? There are workshops that take place in a conference. There's part of the school. And would it include one of the ways in which we engage with a lot of students in the United States is there are clubs on different subjects in types of schools. So there might be an environmental club, a STEM club, even a climate club. That's one of the ways in which we regularly meet with students. And for instance, debriefing becomes real because we meet many times, right? We're constantly meeting. So if we do some big thing and successfully take a climate action, then we can, we can debrief and then we can do a presentation at the AGU conference, for instance. How does it work in Europe?
Great. That's great. I mean, that's exactly how it should be, in my view. What I would add is that the debrief you're meeting in the club, in my view, should be structured a little bit like that I showed in a few slides before this. In other words, you start off with the emotions. And generally, people will only talk about or feel comfortable talking about what happened and their role and the weaker things and the strong points and all that once they have expressed their feelings. And there's a tendency, in my experience, for men to be much more shy of expressing their feelings. And when they're doing the first form, where the first question is first question is always, what were your emotions during the game and what are they now? And I go around and check what they're writing. And sometimes they start writing, well, this person started to do this. So I go around and put my hands on his shoulders and I say, that's not the question. Read the question carefully, saying, what did you feel? What were your emotions? Did you feel unhappy, sad, angry? That's what we want to hear here. Women tend not to have that problem. They're much more willing to express their emotions. But maybe that's just my prejudice. But That's also my experience. Because generally in class, and I guess it's much less so in your club meetings, emotions are taboo. In a classroom, you don't talk about emotions. Emotions stay at the door. And that's one of the problems that teachers have of running games that generate strong emotions, is that they themselves don't know quite how to handle it. And that's because they don't debrief it. The best way of handling is debriefing it. And it's just not something that's done very much in classrooms. Much more, I would imagine, in clubs, but it still, in my view, needs to be structured. So if you can use a form with some simple questions where they can write, I think it will separate out the different aspects of the participation. And I think that once they've been through this 2-3 times, they become much more at ease to express themselves and their emotions. And I remember when I taught at Penn State for a semester, and I remember in one of my classes I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. It was on curriculum design and materials development, and I was beginning to panic. I'd assigned them one book, and as I was walking down to the classroom, it suddenly hit me what I was going to do. And it was a semester-long simulation where they were all developing materials. And at the last class, everybody had finished their stuff, and they came with very thick portfolios of all their materials. And there was one student sitting in the middle there, just thumbing through her portfolio, just sort of in a very lazy way. And I went up to her and I said, "Hey, you should be working." And she knew I was teasing her. And she looked up at me, she says, "I'm so proud of what I've done." And that made the whole class for me. And I'll always remember that. Because it's their thing. And the debriefing happened pretty well every week during this. And brings me here now. For instance, the basic pattern is do a game or an activity in the debrief. Then you have one game and you do little mini debriefs during the game, especially if it's a long one. I've done quite a lot of whole semester simulations, and they're really engaging. And then the third one is you do a game, then you debrief it, and that feeds into the second game, debrief it, and so on. So there are different ways in which you can sequence these things. Oops, what's happening here? So I like your way of doing things in the club. I mean, I'd love to come and watch that and observe it. But maybe you can do a thing for the next present it. You said you did present it in the AGU.
Yes, well, and perhaps, again, if I can encourage the young people to get together, they could all get together on a Zoom meeting and you take part as well. Then we can, each presenting what they do, each talking, have a conversation. I mean, I'm going to nudge every time I can to allow the young people to have the authority to talk with each other, right? And then us adults be multi-generational and part of it, but let them have a voice.
Mm-hmm. That's great. There's one platform that I really like. It's Discord. What's great about it? Well, the two things. One is free. Secondly, you can combine rooms any way you want. And so people can meet in small groups, and you can jump around from group to group, and you can combine these and so on. And I ran a 3-week simulation online with that, because people had to work in small groups and do writing. So that's something to think of. Zoom is a little bit kind of constrained as far as I can tell. But on, what's it called that I say, the previous platform I mentioned, what's it
Discord.
called? Sorry?
Discord.
Discord, right.
Mhm.
That's very configurable. But anyway, let me go on here. So now I'm coming up to I'm going to complain. So we have a wide range of domains and professions that use simulation. They make it compulsory to debrief. They do research on debriefing. They publish articles on debriefing and books. And they consider debriefing to be at the heart of their training. I'm not sure whether you knew that, but it's the case. So let's have a look. Airlines. No pilot can fly a plane unless he's being trained in a simulation. And no simulation is done without full debriefing. So, and they consider that if you don't debrief, you don't learn. And I've been in one of these simulators. What you see at the bottom picture here, this big white bubble, actually contains a whole cockpit that you see on the right. The right is a cockpit. It's a simulated cockpit. And I've been in one, and it's absolutely fabulous to fly this plane. I flew a Boeing over Rio de Janeiro. This is why living in Singapore, that was quite something. And that I take as a kind of the ultimate in simulation training. And then there's medical stuff. They have a motto, safety first, never first time on a patient. And simulation in some places is compulsory for some medical professions. I believe it is now in the United States. And they developed all sorts of things about debriefing. They have a thing called debriefing with good judgment. And then they have promoting excellence and reflective learning in simulation. It's basically debriefing, thing they call pearls. And it's very well done. I just recently attended a seminar by the French medical simulation group called Difficult Debriefing. And I learned quite a lot there. Military, of course, as you know. I won't go into that, but I went to a military base in San Antonio for a whole day, and we looked at them training on simulators. It's just before the war in Iraq. Navigation, bridges on ships, they use simulation and debriefing. And there you can see that the debriefing is a central part of it. So a big question. Why do we in the softer professions like teaching, ocean and climate literacy, why don't we debrief? Why don't we consider debriefing? Do we avoid debriefing? Some people minimize it, pay lip service to it, and some actually deny the necessity of debriefing. I've talked with people in gaming in France, and they say, oh, I don't need to debrief, they'll learn. And I'm a bit flabbergasted. I say, well, you actually do. You should really go and read the literature about it and say, oh, no need, they'll learn. And this is the kind of thing that is a problem. And I say that people who deny the importance of debriefing remind me of climate deniers. And it's actually something that opens up, and the students or the participants really get the feeling that they're learning, that they're discovering things. So that's kind of where I wanted to get to. Few quotes. That's me diving. And after diving, we go up on the boat and we debrief. Now, I think Rachel mentioned that there is a Geoscience Communication Journal special issue on climate and ocean education. And I'd love to have your articles in there. Rachel has just had one, it's just come out. Fantastic article. And there's also one by this guy, Gerald Kutney, who wrote this book, Climate Denial in American Politics. You see him very active on social media. So now the other thing is that you will find a chapter in ResearchGate. If you take a photo of that QR code, it will lead you to the link and you can download the chapter for free. And it's got a lot of the stuff that I talked about today, some theory, a lot of practical stuff. It's got lots of examples of forms and ways to go through each steps. And it may help you. That's the thing to link to. But I can send Rachel the link after. Any questions? Comments?
Thank you, David. That was a great presentation. I appreciate you taking your time. And yes, if anyone has any questions, I had a couple, but I wanted to give opportunity for anyone else to ask. Jim's got his hand raised. Go ahead, Jim.
Sure, but I also don't want to ask too many questions. If somebody else has one, please go first. Then I can wait after that, Fred.
So maybe Jim or James,
Sure.
if you have a question.
Yeah, so it would be interesting to flesh out a little bit more why in certain forms of education, I think also in terms of climate literacy, is there such resistance to debriefing? Why is that so unimportant? And what does that say about those that think it's important compared to those that don't? I mean, there's a little bit of what kind of comes up when we get, well, what the students actually are thinking and feeling doesn't really matter.
Gosh, that's a pretty big question. I don't think there are any simple answers. I think that it depends on teachers. It depends on teachers, in my view. I'm sorry to be rather critical, but my teachers, in my view, tend to be a pretty conservative lot. They don't want to change. They don't want to learn. They're teaching other people to learn stuff. But I'm talking, my experience is mostly now in France, but you know, I've taught in Singapore, and there people, a lot of the teachers at the university, they just did their thing. They didn't want to know about new things. And while I was in the States, for 5 years, the people who really wanted to know were the trainee teachers that I had. They were very keen on learning new things, but teachers who'd already started work and been in the business for 10, 15 years, they settled down in their own habits and didn't want to move forward. And
David, as a teacher, I have to say I've witnessed that, not myself, but a lot of people get stuck or maybe just comfortable in whatever it is that they're teaching or incorporating in their teaching, and they don't tend to really want to change. So I can see that.
I think that's one element. I think another element is fear. If you want to do something interesting in a classroom, it's going to be different from the run-of-the-mill chalk and talk. People are going to start to participate. They're going to talk. They're going to run around the classroom. And I think some teachers are afraid of losing control. And if you're afraid of losing control, you're going to cling on. You're not going to let them do anything which is going to threaten that feeling that you have of control. The thing is, if the students are actually doing something they're really interested in, that's by far the best way to control them. And if you want to control them, of getting them to move on. And maybe I can relate a class, probably my best class, was a class where I wasn't there. So let me explain. I was teaching in a university in France, and every week with this particular class, it was a master's class, I think, or what's it called, licence, bachelor's. And every week I got them to take part in a simulation about some ecological thing and then debrief it. And we did this for 3 or 4 weeks, and the actual pattern of the simulation and the debrief was the same. And then one third or fourth class, I came in and I said, look, next week I can't be here because I'm going to a conference. Would you like to try something that maybe you've never done before? And they all said, oh, yes, because young people like to try things like that. I said, okay, well, how about if you come to class, I'll give you the materials, and you come to class and you do the class as if in the same ways you've been doing it, but I won't be there. And there were a couple of hesitations, and then people said, well, okay, well, let's just try. And then, so 2 weeks later, I went back to the classroom and I said, so how was it? And they say, we've never worked so hard in a class before. So I think the thing is, teachers tend to be a little shy of trusting the students. I think we can trust them a lot more than we do. And it's a pity. I mean, you get certain kinds of teaching like Montessori and other organizations that do very participatory activities, but standard teaching is not done very much. So, and I remember another little episode in France, another place in France, more recently. I got people to build little towers with Lego in small groups. They all have roles which correspond to the different roles that you have in teams. The towers thing that you saw, that was actually much more elaborate. But anyway, they run around and they tend to raise their voice. And oh yes, and then the following one, they have to build a bridge. And they have to, and has to have certain dimensions, height and span and so on. And it has to carry a certain weight for it to pass. And so at the end, they each go round and somebody puts a weight on their bridge. And of course, if it passes, everybody roars and claps and say, you know. And then at the end of the class, I came out of the door, and at the same time, a teacher from the class next door came out. He said, your class makes a lot of noise. I said, yeah, but my class, they're working hard. I never heard from him again. So and of course, some universities and schools, they encourage that kind of thing. Others don't. And I'm not quite sure if there is a solution. I think the solution is that everybody does it, but that's not going to happen tomorrow. If students grow up participating in practical activities and then debriefing them, and all the work that goes on after, is going to be much more accepted. It's going to be the normal kind of thing that people do. And teachers are not going to be so afraid.
And David, maybe perhaps a little less ambitious would be, rather than worry about trying to change the entire educational system, having
Right.
those that believe in this and do this connect with and support each other, even if it's a
Mm.
small minority.
Mm.
You know, that we believe in students actually being active members of society, of leaders, learning to
Mhm.
do that, not coming
Mhm.
to school to be taught. As we have a saying in the United States that you know, it's often said that education is a pipeline. It's no mistake that it uses the fossil fuel industry point of view, that people are a product to go through a pipeline.
Right, right. Oh, yes. I mean, there's a huge lot of pressure for people to pass these debilitating exams and to get on and so on. But if you're interested in sort of exploring this whole area of games, specifically games, the North American Simulation and Gaming Association has a conference every year. I used to go to it, and you generally learn a lot at these conferences because they actually play games at the conferences. You have a long session, say 3 hours, where you can play a game and debrief it and discuss it and so on. And you're there with like-minded people, and it gives you, what's it called, confidence to use it. I mean, at the beginning, this was years and years and years ago, I was kind of a bit nervous about doing this in class. And as time has gone on, I've become much more confident, and I think the students probably realize it and they just go for it.
So David, I just wanted to mention it's 2 past 2, and we are starting to lose some folks having to go to other meetings.
Okay, right.
But we're so thankful for this presentation, and we actually have a request. Would you
Mhm.
be willing to share the slides that
Yeah,
you
sure, no
presented
problem.
today? Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll do that.
I'll pop them off to you with WeTransfer.
Okay,
Okay.
perfect. That's great.
And then with the other things about the conference in Poland and about iSaga, they're all worth attending at least once. And okay,
Oh,
well, it's been a great time chatting with you folks. I hope it's been a little bit useful.
yes, thank you. And we are getting some great feedback in the chat, and we should be able
Okay.
to share that with you too. But thanks again, David. Thank you for everyone for coming. We've stopped the recording.